Hey guys, thank you very much for joining me tonight. Picture this, a pale dawn in Kensington Palace. Its walls echoing with silence, its rooms crowded, not with warmth, but with rules. Inside, a little girl grows up under watchful eyes, every step measured, every letter read, every friend carefully chosen by others. That girl is Victoria, destined to sit on the throne of the world's most sprawling empire. But right now she is simply a child trapped in a gilded cage. If it were you, would you mourn your husband for the rest of your life like Queen Victoria? Be honest, I bet. At least some of you would have started dating again by year 2. Before we begin, a little favor tap. Subscribe and give us a thumbs up to help our bedtime story family grow. Now snuggle in and let tonight's story guide you softly into a night full of calm and beautiful dreams. Share in the comments how you feel right now, tired, anxious, maybe a little restless. Sometimes putting words to our feelings helps them loosen their grip. Take a slow, deep breath, settle into your favorite spot, and let the gentle rhythm of this story carry you far from today's worries. Victoria's childhood was the opposite of carefree. Born in 1819, she was a small, spirited girl with piercing blue eyes and a temper that could surprise even her nannies. Her father, the Duke of Kent, died when she was just 8 months old, leaving her future entirely in the hands of her widowed mother, the Duchess of Kent, and a shadowy advisor named Sir John Conroy. Together, they devised what became infamous as the Kensington system. Imagine every hour of your day written on a chart, from the moment you open your eyes to the time you're tucked back into bed. No privacy, no freedom, no sneaking off to grab cookies in the kitchen, because trust me, Victoria would have tried. She was never allowed to play with other children, freely never permitted to walk downstairs without holding someone's hand. Even her food was monitored, lest too much cake spark unruly joy. The idea was to mold her into a compliant queen who could be controlled by her mother and Conroy. What they underestimated was the girl's iron will. Even at age 5, when told she must always walk down the stairs clutching someone's hand, she snapped back, "I will not." That stubbornness would prove more useful later than any textbook. A mainstream fact here, Victoria's isolation was deliberate. Her mother feared rival branches of the royal family might influence her or even harm her. Historians still argue whether this paranoia was justified or simply Conroy's manipulation to tighten his grip on power. But in those endless Kensington halls, Victoria's world shrank to her dolls, her tutor, and her sketchbooks. She owned a collection of nearly 130 dolls, dressed in tiny costumes from different nations, her miniature way of controlling the world she could not yet touch. A quirky tidbit. She sometimes wrote letters to these dolls, as if they were pen pals recording their adventures and opinions in neat, childish handwriting. Yes, even future queens have imaginary friends. She learned languages, history, and music under strict instruction, but she also developed a private inner world full of secret thoughts and diary entries. Later in life, she would keep journals obsessively, nearly 60 million words over her lifetime. One can only imagine the practice began in those lonely Kensington rooms where paper and ink became her safest confidence. As she entered her teens, her sense of being both trapped and destined sharpened. She knew she stood close to the throne, but she also felt like a prisoner in her own home. When Conroy tried to bully her into signing a document granting him power if she became queen before adulthood, she flatly refused. Small, pale, barely in her teens, she faced down a grown man with absolute defiance. Even then, she understood something vital. Once she gave in, she would never be free. In one almost comical scene, Conroy insisted that Victoria should ride out with him in the park, seated proudly beside him like a queen in waiting. She responded by bursting into tears and clinging to her governess, refusing to budge. Imagine the future ruler of half the world red-faced and sobbing like a stubborn child, but winning the battle all the same. Sometimes tears are just weapons in disguise. The Kensington system may have kept her isolated, but it also sharpened her core traits: independent suspicion of flattery, and a deep craving for love on her own terms. By the time she reached 17, Victoria was short, in stature, often dressed simply, but her eyes sparkled with resolve. She had become exactly what her guardians feared, not a pliable pawn, but a determined young woman ready to rule herself, and soon an empire. And as she looked out from those palace windows, she must have wondered how long before her life stopped being a doll's house and became a kingdom. Victoria's childhood years had been marked by suffocating control, but by the time she was in her mid-teens, whispers began to stir through court corridors. This girl, this quiet young woman with serious blue eyes, might soon sit on the throne of Britain. The idea seemed improbable at first. She was born fifth in line with plenty of healthy uncles ahead of her. But the royal family in the early 19th century had a spectacular knack for both scandal and tragedy. One by one, the men who stood before her either died without children or produced heirs who never survived. Her father, Edward, Duke of Kent, had been the fourth son of King George III. He was not expected to inherit anything of substance, which is why his sudden death after Victoria's birth seemed at first just a private blow, not a political earthquake. But slowly, the balance shifted. George IV, the reigning monarch, had only one legitimate daughter, Princess Charlotte, and she died young in childbirth, a national heartbreak that left the throne without a direct heir. The next brothers fumbled their duty to provide legitimate children, leaving the line of succession looking thin. And so by the time Victoria was a teenager, she had become the single bright spark in a rather gloomy dynasty. Ministers began watching her closely. Her tutors trained her more rigorously, and her mother, always ambitious, tightened her grip. The Duchess of Kent made sure Victoria was paraded at events like a prized jewel, though always under her watchful eye. The unspoken message was clear: here is the future of the monarchy, but only through us. A mainstream fact by law, Victoria could not rule until she turned 18. If the throne fell vacant before, then her mother would act as regent, exactly what Conroy and the Duchess schemed for. Historians still argue whether the Duchess truly loved her daughter or merely saw her as a ticket to power. Either way, Victoria could sense it, and the more she sensed it, the more she resisted. A quirky tidbit comes from Victoria's own diaries. When she was 12, she looked at a family tree and realized with a shiver that she was next in line. "I will be good," she wrote, almost like a promise to herself. Think about that. While most 12-year-olds today worry about school exams or TikTok dances, Victoria was privately preparing to wear a crown. Imagine having that pop up in your planner between math homework and piano practice. Still, the crown was a double-edged sword. Her isolation continued. Her mother insisted she never be alone with her royal uncles, suspecting they might try to manipulate her loyalty. Victoria longed for freedom, for companionship, even just for a normal teenage walk in the park. Instead, her days were filled with lessons, embroidery, endless supervision, and those dreaded advice sessions with Conroy, who never missed a chance to push his influence. She detested him so thoroughly that she sometimes feigned illness just to avoid his company. As the 1830s rolled on the aging King William IV, her uncle sat on the throne. He had no legitimate heirs, and the pressure grew heavier on young Victoria's shoulders. William, who had a sharp tongue and a flair for theatrical tantrums, despised the Duchess of Kent and loathed Conroy even more. At one dinner, the king famously declared that he hoped to live until Victoria turned 18, so that her mother would never become regent. Imagine your uncle announcing in public that he's only holding on in life to prevent your mother from running the country. Awkward doesn't even begin to cover it. Victoria, caught in the middle, watched all this drama unfold with careful eyes. She learned something essential: the monarchy was not just about crowns and jewels, but about survival in a family that treated power like a chessboard. Every move mattered, and trust was rare. Her teenage years were marked by a peculiar blend of strict routine and bubbling anticipation. She knew something monumental was coming, even if she couldn't say when. She grew stronger, shrewder, and increasingly determined not to let her mother or Conroy dominate her once she reached majority. She even practiced little gestures of independence, choosing her own dresses, refusing to sign documents she didn't agree with, and sometimes locking her door to carve out a few minutes of solitude. By 17, she was still small in stature, barely 5 feet tall, but her presence filled a room. Courtiers noted her dignity and her keen intelligence. Ministers whispered about her promise. Her mother hovered like a hawk, terrified of losing control. And across Britain, people began to pin their hopes on this young woman who'd been raised in suffocating seclusion, yet radiated a stubborn vitality. The crown was not yet on her head, but everyone could feel it. Destiny was closing in. It is June 1837, and the dawn is still heavy with mist when the future finally knocks at Victoria's door. She is just 18, a girl scarcely free of childhood, when a commotion stirs the quiet corridors of Kensington Palace. Footsteps hurry, whispers echo, and then there is a knock, firm, urgent history demanding entrance. The Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Conyngham, two dignified figures with anxious faces, stand waiting. Inside, the young princess, barely awake and wrapped in a simple nightgown, is summoned from her bed. The king is dead. William III has passed away in the night, and with that final breath, the crown slips onto the head of his small, solemn niece. Victoria, shy yet resolute, steps forward into the room, her hair still tousled, her eyes wide with the sudden weight of it all. At dawn, she becomes queen. This is no ceremonial daydream. Imagine it: you wake up a teenager, and by breakfast you are sovereign of the British Empire. Forget algebra tests or part-time jobs. Your morning to-do list now includes leading Parliament and guiding the fate of millions. Historians still argue whether Victoria fully grasped the enormity in that instant, or if she simply clung to the formality drilled into her since childhood. A mainstream fact: Victoria insisted immediately on meeting her ministers alone, without her mother hovering, without Conroy lurking at her shoulder. That decision was more than symbolic. It was her first assertion of authority. She greeted them with composure, her slight figure straight-backed, her voice steady. One observer recalled being astonished at her dignity. Here was no trembling child. Here was a queen, who even in her youth radiated an iron core. A quirky tidbit: when the news first came, Victoria requested an hour alone in her room before addressing anyone. What did she do with that hour? Right in her diary, of course. She scribbled furiously, describing her feelings of awe, grief for her uncle, and the heavy knowledge that I am queen. Her lifelong habit of diarizing history began with this private, trembling moment. Once her ministers departed, she was escorted to St. James's Palace to make her first public appearance as monarch. Crowds gathered, craning their necks for a glimpse of the tiny figure in white silk. She was pale, but determined, her every step watched by people desperate to see what kind of queen she would be. In a family stained by scandal and incompetence, Victoria looked like a fresh start. There is something cinematic in the way it all unfolded. She refused to let her mother and Conroy into her private chambers without permission, already locking them out of power. She sat upon the throne in her first Privy Council surrounded by men 3 times her age, and she presided with a calm authority that startled even the skeptics. It was as though the years of repression had prepared her for this exact moment, suddenly free, suddenly sovereign, suddenly herself. Her youth, of course, sparked unease. Could this sheltered girl manage the machinery of empire ministers debated in whispers? Caricaturists toyed with her image, but she disarmed many doubters with her earnestness. She wrote notes in her small, neat handwriting, she asked questions without arrogance, and she leaned heavily, at least at first, on her beloved Prime Minister Lord Melbourne. He became her guide mentor, and perhaps even the father figure she had always lacked. But that is rushing ahead. For now, we stand with her in the hush of early morning, the candles still flickering, the air cool, her eyes shining with both fear and resolve. The world has shifted, and with it Victoria herself. No longer a prisoner of the Kensington system, she is the ruler of Britain and its empire. Her life, once measured in lessons and doles, is now measured in treaties, laws, and public expectations. And yet she is still just 18, still barely 5 feet tall, still fond of sketching, still quick to blush, still a young woman with a temper hidden beneath her composure. The paradox of Queen Victoria begins here, at once ordinary and extraordinary, fragile and immovable, childlike and commanding. The crown, heavy as it is, seems almost to fit her. The people of London, in that first week of her reign, felt something they had not felt in years. Hope that this young queen might embody dignity, morality and stability after decades of royal embarrassment. She had stepped from the shadow of her mother's control, out of the grasp of Conroy, and into the heart of a nation eager for renewal. And as she took her first breath of freedom as queen, she wrote in her diary the simplest, most human words: "I am very young, and perhaps in many, though not in all things inexperienced, but I am sure that very few have more real goodwill and more real desire to do what is fit and right than I have." The first days of Victoria's reign are a swirl of ceremonial pomp and private tension. On the one hand, the people cheer for their new sovereign, the streets alive with bunting bells and optimism. On the other, the young queen must face her most immediate battle, disentangling herself from her mother and the ever-loathed Sir John Conroy. For years they had expected to guide her reign as regents, treating her like a puppet, whose strings were already in their hands. Instead, she shocked them and the court by firmly asserting her independence. One of her earliest acts was to move her bedroom away from her mother's chambers. It sounds almost like teenage rebellion, slamming the proverbial door and demanding privacy, but in political terms, it was seismic. For the first time in her life, she had a room of her own, a locked door between herself and the Duchess of Kent. Imagine the relief after 18 years of constant surveillance. Victoria finally had space to breathe, think, and simply exist as her own person. The ministers took note. They saw in her determination a promise that this reign would not be controlled from the shadows. But she was still young, inexperienced, and desperately in need of allies. Enter Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister. A charming, silver-haired politician with an easy smile and a talent for soothing words, Melbourne quickly became her confidant. Their relationship, though entirely platonic, was charged with affection. Some called him Lord M, and Victoria adored him, as if he were her guide through the intimidating labyrinth of monarchy. a mainstream fact. Melbourne visited the young queen daily, often lingering for hours discussing politics, etiquette, and the art of ruling. He taught her how to handle petitions, how to phrase speeches, and even how to navigate social scandals. To her, he was a mentor and friend. To critics, he was dangerously influential. Historians still argue whether Victoria leaned too heavily on him, risking the perception that she was his puppet, rather than Britain's sovereign. Quirky tidbit Melbourne was so relaxed in her presence that he sometimes napped in her rooms. Picture it, the Queen of England perched upright in her chair, earnestly asking about the House of Commons, while her Prime Minister dozed gently nearby. It was not exactly the image of thunderous authority, but it reveals how comfortable Victoria felt with him, how much she craved fatherly affection after years of coldness from her mother. Still, her assertiveness sometimes spilled into stubbornness. At her coronation in 1838, she insisted on details that baffled officials. The ceremony itself was clumsy. Peers stumbled, clergy lost track of cues, and one bishop even shoved the coronation ring onto the wrong finger, leaving Victoria wincing in pain. Yet through it all, she radiated youthful dignity. When she processed through the streets, the people roared their approval. She was not just their queen. She was a symbol of fresh beginnings. Behind the public facade, though, her relationship with her mother grew colder. The Duchess of Kent was shocked at being excluded from state matters and enraged at her daughter's refusal to grant Conroy a formal role. Victoria would not budge. She had been shaped by years of suffocating control, and now she dug in her heels. She was polite, but her distance was icy. The once clinging mother became little more than an unwelcome shadow at court. Victoria's youth also made her the subject of gossip. Cartoonists poked fun at her short stature, satirists whispered about her fondness for Melbourne, and skeptics muttered that she was too emotional to rule. But she silenced many of them through sheer diligence. She attended to paperwork diligently, kept a punishing schedule, and met her ministers with discipline that impressed even her critics. At just 19, she wrote in her diary that she had signed more than 100 documents in a single morning. Imagine the royal wrist cramp. She was learning fast. More importantly, she was learning on her own terms. Every refusal of Conroy's demands, every independent decision, and every late-night diary entry was a small victory. Each act chipped away at the image of her as a timid girl and replaced it with that of a monarch in control. Still, the shadows of scandal hovered nearby. Whispers about her attachment to Melbourne, rumours of favouritism at court, and growing tension with her family would soon test her further. The young queen was stepping out of childhood, but the stage she stepped onto was crowded, noisy, and waiting for her to stumble. And yet she didn't. Not yet. Barely had Victoria settled into her throne before the treacherous currents of court politics began tugging at her. She was young, inexperienced, and surrounded by people eager to shape her image, sometimes for their own advantage. It didn't take long before her judgment, her affections, and her independence were tested in very public ways. At the heart of this tension was her fondness for Lord Melbourne. Their daily meetings and a reliance on him created murmurs across the political spectrum. To conservatives, it seemed scandalous, a young queen barely out of girlhood confiding in an older man for hours at a time. To her supporters, it was charming proof that she was a diligent monarch eager to learn. Victoria, however, wasn't interested in political optics. She adored Melbourne's wit, his patience, and his ability to calm her nerves. He was, as she called him, her best and truest friend. But such devotion had consequences. She began to favour those in Melbourne's circle and distance those who opposed him. One of the most infamous incidents was the so-called bedchamber crisis of 1839. Here's the mainstream fact when Melbourne's government collapsed and Robert Peel was asked to form a new one. Victoria resisted. Peel, a Conservative, wanted her to dismiss some of her ladies-in-waiting who happened to be wives and relatives of Whigs Melbourne's allies. To the Queen, this demand felt not only insulting but invasive. Those women were her companions, her emotional support. She refused defiantly. Peel, unable to accept her decision, declined to form a government, and Melbourne returned to office. The crisis sparked outrage. Critics accused Victoria of acting like a spoiled child who put friendship before duty. Crowds booed her at public events, pamphlets mocked her judgment, and some even questioned whether she was fit to reign. Historians still argue whether she was naive or simply standing her ground. Was it a reckless mistake, or the first sign that Victoria would not be bullied into surrendering her inner circle? And then came another storm, the Flora Hastings scandal. A lady-in-waiting. Lady Flora was rumoured to be pregnant, and cruel gossip suggested Sir John Conroy was the father. When Flora's abdomen swelled, Victoria herself suspected immorality and ordered a medical examination. It turned out Lady Flora was not pregnant at all, but gravely ill with a liver tumour. She died soon after, and public fury erupted. People accused the Queen of cruelty, of humiliating a dying woman, of showing herself vindictive. Cartoonists sketched her as a heartless tyrant. Imagine being 20 years old, barely learning to sign state papers correctly, and already facing a PR disaster that makes you the villain of every coffeehouse conversation. A quirky tidbit during the backlash. One newspaper published a poem likening Victoria to Marie Antoinette, hardly the bedtime reading a young queen might have wanted. The comparison haunted her, though she tried to shrug it off. Public opinion was fickle, she discovered, and could turn from cheers to jeers in a matter of weeks. Despite the humiliation, these scandals taught her something vital. The monarchy was not just about private comfort or personal affection. It was about perception. Every action, no matter how small, could be weaponized. Every word could echo through pamphlets and speeches. She had to learn the hard way that her private instincts, loyalty to Melbourne's suspicion of Flora, resistance to Peel, could have seismic public consequences. Yet through it all, Victoria clung to her diary, pouring out her frustrations in long entries. She vented about the wicked lies spread about her, lamented the cruelty of gossip, and reassured herself that she was doing her best. In those private pages you hear not the voice of a marble queen, but of a young woman wounded and bewildered trying to reconcile her heart with her crown. It is in these early struggles that Victoria's resilience takes shape. She stumbles, yes. She errs, certainly. But she does not break. Instead, she absorbs the blows, learns the lesson, and sharpens her sense of self. She begins to realize that though she needs allies, she must ultimately steer her own course. The public may mock her, ministers may scold her, but she alone wears the crown. And so, amid the whispers of scandal and the sting of criticism, Victoria takes her first steps as a monarch in her own right. Not perfect, not untouchable, but undeniably determined. It is often said that history turns on small moments, and for Victoria, one of those moments came when she met her cousin Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. At first glance, the match seemed ordinary enough. Two royal cousins brought together by family scheming. But in truth, it was anything but ordinary. Their connection would become the central romance of Victoria's life and the partnership that defined her reign. Victoria had first met Albert when she was a teenager. He and his brother Ernest visited England in 1836, sent by their ambitious uncle King Leopold of Belgium, who hoped to secure a dynastic union. At the time, Victoria noted Albert's good looks and gentle manners in her diary, but nothing more. He was polite, intelligent, and musically gifted, but she was still young, still finding her feet as a presumptive, and not ready to consider marriage seriously. Fast forward 3 years. By 1839, Victoria was queen in her own right, and the question of marriage was pressing. Suitors swirled around her princes, dukes, all with gleaming pedigrees and expectant families. But when Albert returned to England, the chemistry was undeniable. He had matured into a striking young man, tall, dark-haired, reserved, but deeply thoughtful. Victoria, who often complained in her diary about dull company at court, found herself captivated, a mainstream fact by law and custom, as the reigning monarch Victoria had to propose to Albert, not the other way around. On October 15, 1839, after only a few days of renewed acquaintance, she summoned her cousin to her private rooms at Windsor Castle. Nerves jittered in her stomach, but she pressed on, declaring that she wished they should marry. Albert accepted with quiet grace, and just like that, history tilted. Quirky tidbit. Victoria's diary entry that evening was nothing short of giddy. She wrote, "It was the happiest, brightest moment in my life. I told him I loved him more than I can say. Oh, to feel I am loved by such an angel, it is too much. This is not the voice of a solemn queen, but of a love-struck young woman swooning like any other." Yet the romance was not without its complications. Albert was German with no independent wealth, and many in Britain sneered at the idea of a foreign prince marrying their queen. Critics feared he would meddle in politics, or worse, try to dominate her. Even in her own court, there were mutterings about his influence before he had even unpacked his trunks. Historians still argue whether Albert was initially reluctant about the match torn between duty and personal feeling, or whether he fell as deeply in love as Victoria did, right from the start. But for Victoria, there was no doubt. She was head over heels. In letters to Albert before their wedding, she poured out her heart with a vulnerability that shocks readers used to her later iron-willed persona. She confided fears, longings, even insecurities about her looks and her role. To Albert, she was not a queen, but a woman craving affection and trust. Their wedding in February 1840 was a spectacle of pomp and sentiment. Victoria wore a white gown trimmed with orange blossoms, a choice that set a fashion trend still with us today. Before, her brides of rank usually wore silver or even coloured dresses. But Victoria's white gown paired with a long veil captured the imagination of the public, and the white wedding became a cultural norm. A quirky fashion legacy for a woman who at the time was more focused on blushing and clutching her new husband's hand than setting bridal trends. The wedding was both deeply personal and politically symbolic. Bells rang across London, crowds cheered, and even skeptics softened as they saw the radiant young couple. Victoria's joy was palpable. After years of loneliness and tension with her mother, she finally had the companionship she longed for. Her diary after their wedding night, delicately phrased, makes clear her exhilaration. "Oh, how I adore him, how I dote on him, how I love him." She wrote. Let's just say subtlety was not her strong suit. Still, marriage did not mean an abdication of power. Victoria remained fiercely protective of her authority, sometimes to Albert's frustration. He, raised in a strict and intellectual household, imagined marriage as a partnership of equals, perhaps with himself in the lead. Victoria, however, had no intention of surrendering her sovereignty even to the man she adored. Their early married life would prove to be a tug-of-war between love and power, affection and pride. But for the moment, in those early days of engagement and wedding bliss, all seemed golden. Victoria had found her partner, her confidant, her angel. For a girl once trapped in Kensington's cage, the freedom to choose her own love and to embrace it so passionately was nothing short of revolutionary. The honeymoon glow of Victoria and Albert's marriage did not fade quickly, but it also came with the realities of sharing life, love, and politics. From the outside, their union looked like a fairy tale queen, and Prince radiant in their youth, strolling arm in arm through palace gardens. From the inside, it was far more complex, two strong-willed personalities negotiating not only affection, but authority. Victoria adored Albert with the fervour of a woman who had known very little warmth in her childhood. She leaned on him emotionally, writing long, effusive diary entries about his tenderness, his looks, even his sense of order. She called him her angel so often it could have been his unofficial title. Yet she was also Queen of England, fiercely protective of her prerogatives. She bristled at the idea that anyone, even her beloved husband, might direct her decisions. Albert, on the other hand, came from a background steeped in German discipline and intellectual seriousness. He believed marriage should be a partnership, yes, but one with structure, preferably with himself steering certain aspects. He was appalled by what he saw as inefficiency and frivolity in the British court. He wanted reform, order, and improvement. That tension produced sparks. Imagine two newlyweds arguing not about where to put the sofa, but about the governance of an empire. A mainstream fact, Albert gradually earned influence by sheer persistence and competence. He immersed himself in paperwork, advised Victoria on political matters, and drafted speeches. Ministers who once dismissed him as a foreign interloper began to respect his diligence. Still, Victoria sometimes exploded in temper when she felt he was overstepping. Their quarrels could be fiery, her diary records moments of shouting, sulking, even tears. But just as often, the storm passed into passionate reconciliation. Quirky, tidbit Victoria was so openly affectionate toward Albert that she scandalized her courtiers. She once burst into his study unannounced, flung her arms around him, and insisted on kisses while officials stood awkwardly nearby, pretending to study the wallpaper. Even queens can forget the audience when love is involved. Their marriage was also marked by domestic intimacy that was unusual for royalty. They preferred simple dinners en famille rather than endless banquets. They played duets on the piano, read poetry aloud, and took long walks with their dogs. Victoria sketched Albert in her private notebooks, while Albert designed improvements for their homes, from plumbing to decoration. Their shared love of art and culture brought them together, even as their tempers sometimes pulled them apart. Historians still argue whether Albert's growing role in state matters was entirely healthy for Victoria's independence. Some say he strengthened her reign by giving her stability and counsel. Others argue he made her dependent, even diminished her authority in subtle ways. What is certain is that she adored him utterly, even when they quarrelled. After one argument, she wrote tearfully that she could not bear his disapproval. "It breaks my heart when he is vexed with me." For a queen who could freeze politicians with a glance, her vulnerability in marriage was striking. Children, of course, soon followed, though perhaps sooner and more often than Victoria would have liked. In 1840, she gave birth to her first child, Princess Victoria, nicknamed Vicky. The experience was both terrifying and overwhelming for the young queen. She had once written that pregnancy was an occupying inconvenience and labour left her shaken. Yet Albert was deeply attentive, holding her hand and refusing to leave her side. Their bond deepened in those moments, though the prospect of balancing motherhood with monarchy would prove a constant challenge. It was in these early years of marriage that Victoria and Albert also began to shape their public image as a model family-loving spouses doting parents, and moral exemplars in an age hungry for stability. The Victorian ideal of domestic virtue, so often associated with her reign, had its roots in this partnership. Their very ordinariness, quarrels, cuddles, nursery dramas, was presented as extraordinary because it came from a queen and her prince. Yet the pressures of public scrutiny never disappeared. Every argument, every pregnancy, every shift in political alliances was watched and judged. And behind the curtain of palace life, Victoria and Albert continued to wrestle with the delicate balance of two people bound by both love and the weight of empire. For now, though, their marriage glowed with possibility. Together they seemed to embody a new vision of monarchy, not just crowns and ceremonies, but hearth and home laughter and love, two young souls building not only a dynasty, but a partnership that would ripple across history. Marriage had brought Victoria the affection she craved, but it also brought the less glamorous side of royal duty children, lots of them. Between 1840 and 1857, she bore 9 in total, transforming her household into a bustling nursery that sometimes looked more like organized chaos than imperial majesty. For a woman who once cherished her independence and bristled at confinement, the endless cycle of pregnancies was both a blessing and a burden. Her first child, Princess Victoria Vicky, arrived just months after the wedding. Then came Albert Edward Bertie, who would one day inherit the throne, followed by Alice Alfred Helena, Louise Arthur Leopold, and Beatrice. 9 tiny monarchs in waiting, each with their own quirks and dramas, filled the palaces with noise, laughter, and more than a few tantrums. Mainstream fact Victoria was not, by her own admission, a particularly maternal figure. She loved her children deeply, but she also complained about the physical toll of pregnancy and the inconvenience of motherhood. She once wrote that she found babies frightful when they are undressed, hardly the glowing words of maternal bliss. Albert, on the other hand, adored the role of father. He designed nurseries, supervised lessons, and insisted on strict discipline. While Victoria sulked about swollen ankles and noisy toddlers, Albert revelled in family life, sometimes leaving the Queen feeling overshadowed in her own home. Historians still argue whether Victoria's frank complaints about motherhood were selfish or simply refreshingly honest. Was she a neglectful mother by Victorian standards, or was she just brave enough to admit what countless women of her era were forced to hide, that constant pregnancies could be exhausting, frightening, and even depressing? A quirky tidbit: Victoria disliked breastfeeding so much that she considered it disgusting. Instead, wet nurses were employed, which was common at the time among the aristocracy. She also gave her children pet nicknames, Bertie, Vicky, Lenchen, yet often described them in her diary with surprising bluntness. She called Bertie the future King Edward VII, naughty and troublesome so often it became practically his official title. The practicalities of raising a dynasty often collided with the politics of empire. Each birth was not just a private family affair, but a public event scrutinized by ministers and foreign courts. Suitors were already whispered about before some of the children could even walk. Vicky, for example, was eventually married off to the Crown Prince of Prussia, while Bertie was groomed for kingship, even as he struggled miserably with schoolwork. Family life was not without tragedy. Several of Victoria's children suffered health issues. Her son Leopold was born with haemophilia, a dangerous blood disorder that would later claim his life young and ripple through European royal families. Another child, Alice, died of diphtheria at just 42, devastating Victoria decades later. But even in the nursery years, illness hung over the palace like a shadow. And yet, for all her complaints, Victoria relished the image of domesticity her family projected. The public adored pictures of the Queen and Prince Albert surrounded by their brood, frolicking at Osborne House or Balmoral. Painters were commissioned to capture the family in sentimental scenes, the Queen holding a baby Albert, reading to the older children, pets napping nearby. These images were carefully cultivated propaganda, turning the royal family into the very model of Victorian virtue. But behind the glossy portraits, the reality was often stormier. Victoria and Albert sometimes clashed fiercely over parenting styles. Albert insisted on order and discipline. Victoria indulged bursts of temper and impatience. Their arguments could leave the children caught in the middle. Bertie in particular bore the brunt. Victoria thought him lazy. Albert thought him hopeless, and both scolded him relentlessly. Ironically, this naughty boy would one day prove a popular and effective king. Quieter moments, though, were sweeter. The family loved retreats to Balmoral in Scotland, where the children could romp outdoors free from court protocol. Victoria adored those Highland escapes, sketching the mountains and breathing air free of London smog. In those moments she could set aside the burdens of empire and simply be mama. In the end, her sprawling family was both her pride and her trial. Each child carried a fragment of her legacy, each marriage extended her influence across Europe, and each misbehavior sparked one of her legendary tirades. For a queen who once grew up with dolls for company, the cacophony of 9 children must have felt overwhelming, exhilarating, and occasionally absurd. And all of this, the personal chaos of the nursery and the political weight of dynastic planning, was only a prelude to the grander visions Albert carried in his mind, visions that would soon reshape how the world saw Britain itself. By the mid-19th century, Britain was humming with energy. Railways carved through countryside steam engines puffed across landscapes, and factories churned out goods faster than ever before. The Industrial Revolution was no longer just a buzzword, it was daily reality. And into this age of progress stepped Prince Albert, with an idea so bold it seemed almost fanciful, a vast exhibition that would showcase not just Britain's power, but the achievements of the entire modern world. Albert envisioned a celebration of industry, art, and science that would put London at the centre of global imagination. Victoria, ever devoted to her husband, threw her full support behind him. At first, politicians scoffed. The cost, the logistics, the sheer audacity, but Albert pressed on, sketching plans, rallying committees, and persuading skeptics with his quiet determination. Victoria watched with pride as her husband transformed from the foreign prince into the architect of one of the century's greatest spectacles. Mainstream fact: the Great Exhibition of 1851 took place in Hyde Park, housed in the dazzling Crystal Palace, a structure of glass and iron so massive and shimmering that it seemed plucked from a fairy tale. Designed by Joseph Paxton, it was erected in just 9 months, stretching 848 feet long and enclosing trees within its glassy walls. Over 6 million visitors, equivalent to a third of Britain's population, flocked to marvel at inventions and treasures from around the globe. Quirky tidbit: among the exhibits was the famous Koh-i-Noor diamond, placed in a special case, but so poorly lit that visitors joked it looked like a lump of glass. Another curiosity: an American company displayed a novelty mechanical dentures made from hard rubber. Imagine queuing for hours only to gape at teeth in a glass case. Even Queen Victoria inspected them with interest, though one imagines she preferred the crown jewels to a row of chattering molars. For Victoria, the exhibition was a triumph of spectacle. She adored processions through the crowds, adored Albert's shining moment, adored the sight of the British public mingling with international guests beneath the glittering roof. She wrote in her diary of the thrill of seeing thousands of people, rich, Singapore, British, foreign, all moving peacefully together, a beautiful sight to behold. Historians still argue whether the exhibition was more about genuine international exchange or a subtle declaration of British supremacy. After all, the message was clear: Britain stood at the heart of a global empire, and everyone else was a guest in its glass palace. The event also carried personal resonance. For years, Albert had been dismissed as dull meddlesome, or simply too German. Now, he was hailed as a visionary. Newspapers praised him, crowds cheered him, and even politicians grudgingly admitted his genius. Victoria basked in reflected pride, her love for him swelling with vindication. She famously remarked that the exhibition was the greatest day in our lives, a testament not just to Britain's glory, but to her husband's triumph. But the exhibition was not only a patriotic pageant, it was a family outing too. Victoria and Albert often toured the displays with their children in tow, pointing out marvels like the new daguerreotype photographs or the colossal steam engines that rattled the floor. The children squealed, the Queen jotted notes in her diary, and Albert beamed as though the world had assembled just for them. The legacy of the exhibition stretched beyond its closing day. The profits funded cultural institutions still famous today: the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, and the Natural History Museum. The very landscape of South Kensington became a memorial to that glittering summer of progress. And yet, beneath the glitter shadows lingered. Not all admired Albert's efficiency. Some accused him of overshadowing his wife. Others mocked the extravagance at a time when poverty and unrest simmered in Britain's cities. The exhibition, for all its grandeur, was also a mirror, reflecting both the optimism of an age and the inequalities it tried to hide. For Victoria, however, it was proof that monarchy could embrace modernity. No longer a relic of old feudal pomp, the crown could stand at the forefront of progress. And as she clasped Albert's hand on the closing day, tears in her eyes, she must have felt that together they had captured lightning in glass and iron. The shimmering glass of the Crystal Palace had barely dimmed when Victoria and Albert faced a sobering truth. Britain's greatness did not rest only on inventions and pageantry, but on the sprawling empire beyond its shores. From India to Africa to the Caribbean territories under the Union, Jack were expanding rapidly, and with them came triumphs, tensions and contradictions. Victoria herself never travelled to most of these far-flung lands, yet they loomed large in her reign. Dispatches arrived daily, reports of wars, famines, uprisings and profits. She read of Indian Maharajas sending gifts of jewels, of African expeditions, braving jungles of colonial administrators, boasting of railroads and telegraphs. To the Queen Empire often arrived as ink on paper and glittering curios in gilded cases. Mainstream fact: by mid-century, the British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the world's population. India in particular became its crown jewel, but this dominance was not achieved without bloodshed. Wars like the Anglo-Sikh conflicts and the Opium Wars in China stained the map red not only with British possessions, but with the costs of conquest. Historians still argue whether Victoria truly grasped the harsher realities of empire famine, cultural suppression, economic exploitation, or whether she clung to the comforting illusion of benevolent rule. A quirky tidbit reveals how empire crept even into her family life. Exotic animals arrived at Windsor as gifts: parrots that squawked through palace corridors, and once even a cheetah from an Indian prince which prowled the royal grounds in bewildered majesty. Imagine the royal gardeners nervously trimming roses while a spotted predator strolled nearby. Victoria's relationship with the empire was personal as well as political. She took a keen interest in Indian culture, commissioning paintings of Indian scenes, hiring Indian attendants, and even peppering her journals with Hindustani phrases later in life. Yet this fascination coexisted with the cold reality of imperial power. Colonies meant resources, soldiers, and prestige, but also unrest. In the Caribbean, emancipation had freed enslaved people, but the economic aftermath bred new hardships. In Africa, exploration often slid into conquest. Albert, for his part, was more critical of empire. He questioned the morality of wars fought for trade. Advantage lamented the arrogance of some colonial officials and pressed for reforms. Victoria admired his conscience, but she also cherished the glory that empire bestowed upon her throne. After all, it was easier to be the grandmother of Europe when one was also the figurehead of half the world. At home, empire stirred curiosity and pride. Middle-class families filled drawing rooms with souvenirs, teak carvings, Indian shawls, African ivory. Schoolbooks taught children that Britain's mission was to civilize the globe, a story more flattering than accurate. At the same time, critics like Charles Dickens and later reformers pointed out the hypocrisy of celebrating progress at home while hardship festered abroad. For Victoria, the empire also became a way to expand her own authority. She revelled in the role of maternal figure, a queen who could symbolically embrace millions of distant subjects. This image would grow even stronger when she later accepted the title Empress of India, but already in the 1850s, she was imagining herself as more than just Britain's monarch. She was the moral heart of an empire that stretched across oceans. And yet, empire was never just glory. News of revolts and crises unsettled her evenings. When famine struck Ireland during the 1840s, she donated personally, but was accused of stinginess. Her 2,000 contributions seemed meagre compared to the vast suffering. When wars in Asia brought headlines of brutality, she struggled to reconcile the image of loyal subjects with the reality of resistance. It was a paradox she never fully resolved. In her diaries, she could gush over the artistry of Indian jewellery. Then, in the next line, demand stronger measures against colonial unrest. Like many of her countrymen, she lived in the tension between pride and blindness, compassion and command. Still, in the glittering salons of London, the empire was spoken of as destiny. Victoria embodied that destiny whether she understood its costs or not. And as the map of the world grew ever redder with British possessions, the Queen's silhouette seemed to grow larger too, cast not just across England, but across oceans and continents. The story of Victoria's reign takes its darkest turn in December 1861. The Great Exhibition had crowned Albert as a visionary. Their family seemed secure, and Britain's empire was expanding with unstoppable force. Then came illness. Prince Albert, only 42 years old, developed a fever that doctors struggled to explain. Some said typhoid. Others suspect Crohn's or stomach cancer. Whatever the cause, it worsened quickly. Victoria, usually so composed in public, was frantic at his bedside. She clutched his hand, begged him to rally, wept openly in ways that shocked those who saw her. For all their quarrels and differences, Albert had been her anchor, her partner, her angel. On the night of December 14, as snow fell softly outside Windsor Castle, Albert slipped away. The Queen, at 42, was left a widow with 9 children and a crown heavier than ever. The grief was overwhelming. Mainstream fact, Victoria plunged into mourning so deep that it became legendary. She wore black every day for the rest of her life, nearly 40 years. She ordered Albert's rooms to remain exactly as they had been, his clothes laid out hot water brought each morning as though he might return. Historians still argue whether this mourning was a genuine testament of love, a symbol of her stubborn will, or an unhealthy retreat from duty. A quirky tidbit, she even had plaster casts made of Albert's hand and face, which she kept by her bed. Imagine the Queen of England reaching out at night to clasp a cold plaster hand instead of her husband's. It sounds morbid, but to her, it was comfort, a way of keeping him near. Her mourning spilled into public life. She withdrew from ceremonies, avoided London, and secluded herself in Windsor, Osborne, and Balmoral. Ministers fretted. Caricaturists mocked her as the widow of Windsor. Newspapers accused her of abandoning her people. For a monarchy built on visibility, her disappearance was dangerous. Crowds once cheered her name. Now they jeered, calling her selfish, ghost-like, even irrelevant. Yet in private, her grief was raw and real. She wrote endlessly in her journals about Albert, filling page after page with declarations of devotion. She called him her perfect idol, her guide, her protector. Without him, she confessed, she felt helpless and broken. For a woman who once stood so firmly against her mother and Conroy, her dependence on Albert was startling. His death left not just an emotional void, but a practical one. He had managed finances, estates, and much of the machinery of court. Now Victoria had to relearn how to stand alone. Her children, meanwhile, bore the brunt of her grief. She clung to them fiercely, sometimes suffocatingly. She leaned on her eldest daughter Vicky for comfort, pressed Bertie with expectations he could never meet, and smothered Beatrice, her youngest, with such possessiveness that the girl's adulthood was almost swallowed whole. The Queen's mourning became not just her own burden, but her family's prison. Still, her withdrawal had its limits. She continued to sign documents, meet ministers in private, and keep the wheels of state turning. The empire did not pause for grief. Wars broke out, colonies demanded attention, and Parliament required guidance. But the public face of monarchy, the parades, the banquets, the great ceremonies vanished. For years, Britain was ruled by a queen, in shadow, glimpsed, rarely dressed in eternal black. And yet, despite criticism, her mourning struck a chord with many. Widows across the country saw in her sorrow a mirror of their own. Victorians steeped in a culture of death, rituals and memorials admired her fidelity. In time, Victorian mourning became a cultural phenomenon. Black crepe dresses, jet jewellery, elaborate funerals, all inspired by the grieving queen. But make no mistake, beneath the ritual was genuine heartbreak. Albert's death split Victoria's reign into two lives: the bright, passionate queen beside her prince, and the sombre widow, whose shadow stretched across the empire. On the night he died, she wrote in her diary, "My life as a happy one is ended. The world is gone for me." And in many ways, for decades to come, she lived as though that were true. The years following Albert's death were defined by absence. Victoria, once the lively young queen who adored processions and balls, retreated behind heavy drapes and black veils. To the public, she became less a monarch and more a ghostly figure, the widow of Windsor. Her withdrawal was profound. She rarely appeared in London, preferring Windsor Castle, Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, or Balmoral in the Scottish Highlands. Ministers were forced to travel to her, rather than the other way around, trudging through echoing corridors to present papers to a woman who often sat hunched in mourning dress, her eyes red from weeping. For nearly a decade she avoided opening Parliament in person, delegating the task instead. The public, hungry for pageantry, grew restless. Mainstream fact: her seclusion sparked a crisis of popularity. Crowds booed her when she did appear, pamphlets accused her of neglect, and Republican movements gained strength. In 1874, one radical MP declared openly in Parliament that the monarchy was invisible and therefore useless. Historians still argue whether Victoria was selfish in her retreat or simply overwhelmed by grief. Was it dereliction of duty or the very human collapse of a widow who had lost her soulmate. A quirky tidbit captures the absurdity of her withdrawal. At Osborne, she kept a chair set at dinner for Albert, as though he might stroll in late. Servants were instructed to bring hot water to his rooms every morning to lay out his shaving gear and to arrange fresh clothes. Guests had to pretend not to notice that one wing of the palace was maintained for a man long in his grave. For some, it was touching. For others, it seemed almost eerie. And yet, even in seclusion, she exerted enormous influence. Letters flew from her desk daily filled with opinions on politics, family marriages, and foreign affairs. She read dispatches from India and Africa, commented on military appointments, and fretted about her children's futures. She was absent from sight, but not from power. Her family, meanwhile, bore the brunt of her gloom. She leaned heavily on her eldest daughter Vicky for comfort, though Vicky lived abroad after marrying the Crown Prince of Prussia. Her son Bertie, destined to be King Edward VII, infuriated her with his laziness, gambling, and womanizing. She scolded him, relentlessly convinced he could never measure up to Albert. Her youngest daughter, Beatrice, became the focus of suffocating devotion. Victoria clung to her so fiercely that Beatrice's adulthood was almost postponed indefinitely. The public, however, was less sympathetic. Londoners missed their queen. Without her presence at ceremonies, jubilees, or even the theatre, the monarchy seemed hollow. The satirical magazine Punch nicknamed her Mrs. Melbourne in earlier years for her closeness to the Prime Minister, and now lampooned her as the Hermit of Windsor. At one point, a popular song jested with a queen who does nothing at all, sung with a wink in pubs across the city. Still, there were flashes of the old Victoria. At Balmoral, in the rugged Highlands, she found solace in long walks, sketching the mountains and conversing with local tenants. There, wrapped in plaid shawls and surrounded by dogs, she seemed less a sovereign and more a weary widow finding comfort in nature. Historians note that her withdrawal also marked a turning point in how monarchy functioned. Stripped of its constant pageantry, it became more symbolic, more domestic in image. The very ordinariness of her grief resonated with some subjects, even as others fumed at her absence. Britain carried on with industry, empire, and reform, but at its heart was a queen dressed in black, haunting her palaces like a memory. For Victoria, the world had truly gone dim. Yet in that dimness, new relationships, controversial ones, would emerge, pulling her slowly, reluctantly back toward the living. It was in the shadow of Albert's death that John Brown entered Victoria's story, not as a new prince or minister, but as a rugged Highland servant with a thick accent, a brusque manner, and a devotion to his queen that bordered on ferocious. Brown had worked at Balmoral, the royal retreat in Scotland, and his straightforward loyalty caught Victoria's eye when she was at her lowest ebb. He spoke to her not as a fragile monarch, but as a woman in grief, and she found in him a kind of companionship that shocked and intrigued those around her. Brown was everything Albert was not: earthy, blunt, sometimes even rude. He called her woman when scolding her for riding too fast on horseback, and he was known to argue with ministers who disapproved of his familiarity. Yet Victoria adored him. She trusted him implicitly, leaned on him for emotional support, and promoted him in ways that outraged courtiers. She even commissioned a portrait of herself with Brown, a gesture almost unthinkable for a monarch. Mainstream fact, the relationship between Victoria and Brown was so close that it sparked decades of speculation. Some contemporaries believed they were romantically involved, though no evidence proves it. Historians still argue whether theirs was a deep platonic bond, a romance kept secret, or something in between. What is clear is that Victoria valued him as her protector and companion in a world that still felt unbearably empty without Albert. A quirky tidbit, Brown carried a pistol at all times and once claimed he would shoot anyone who threatened the Queen. When Victoria's carriage was attacked by a would-be assassin, it was Brown who wrestled the man to the ground. For her, his blunt loyalty was a tonic against the insincerity of court life. Critics sneered at her attachment, but Victoria insisted he was the best and most devoted servant I ever had. Of course, gossip swirled endlessly. Pamphlets mocked her as Mrs. Brown, suggesting a scandalous intimacy. Courtiers bristled at his influence, complaining that he had too much access to her private life. Ministers rolled their eyes at the thought of a rough Highland gillie giving advice to the Queen of England. Yet Victoria, as always, refused to be cowed by opinion. She defended Brown fiercely, writing that he was a true, faithful, honest soul, as courageous as a lion. Her children, however, were less enthused. Bertie, already resentful of his mother's constant scolding, considered Brown's presence a humiliation. The tension between son and mother grew deeper, with Brown often caught in the middle. Some in the family whispered that Victoria's reliance on him was unseemly, even dangerous for the monarchy's image. But the Queen brushed them off. Her happiness, she declared, mattered too. This period of Victoria's life revealed another contradiction. Publicly, she was still the widow of Windsor, cloaked in black, aloof from ceremonies. Privately, she laughed, with Brown rode through the Highlands, and allowed herself moments of levity that would have scandalized those who thought she was forever frozen in grief. Historians note that this duality, mourning widow and smiling companion, embodied the tension of her reign appearances, shaped by duty feelings, shaped by stubborn will. Quirky moments abounded. Brown once scolded her for staying out in the cold Scottish rain too long, telling her flatly, "You'll catch your death, woman." Imagine any other servant addressing the Queen of England that way, and living to tell of it. Yet she smiled at his candour, perhaps even relished the rare experience of being treated like a human being, rather than a porcelain icon. Still, the gossip never died down. When Brown himself died suddenly in 1883, Victoria mourned him with a depth that startled even her closest advisers. She kept a lock of his hair, his photograph on her bedside table, and letters praising him that she had written in her own hand. Her devotion to his memory echoed her devotion to Albert's, though less gilded, more raw, and far more controversial. In truth, Brown represented something Albert never could: the unvarnished voice of the common man, blunt and fiercely loyal. In his presence, Victoria found a strange kind of freedom, an escape from the suffocating expectations of crown and court. And while scandal sheets whispered and ministers fretted, she lived those years on her own terms, finding in John Brown the comfort of honesty in a world built on ceremony. By the 1870s, Victoria had lived for years in the shadows, part recluse, part grieving widow, part scandalous friend of John Brown. Yet the empire she ruled did not pause for her mourning. Britain was now the most powerful nation on earth, and nowhere was this clearer than in India. It was Albert's dream to see the monarchy linked more directly to the empire, and Victoria herself longed for a new sense of identity. Out of this moment came one of the most striking turns in her reign. She would no longer be merely Queen of the United Kingdom, she would become Empress of India. Mainstream fact. In 1876, at the urging of her Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, Parliament passed the Royal Titles Act, giving Victoria the title Empress of India. Disraeli, ever the showman, argued that such grandeur would bind Britain's most prized colony more firmly to the crown and place Victoria on equal footing with other monarchs such as the Russian Tsar. The Queen was delighted. She adored the title, signing her letters with a flourish, Victoria R. and I, Regina et Imperatrix Queen and Empress. For Victoria, the title was more than political theatre. It gave her a renewed sense of power, a way of stepping back into public life after years of criticism for her seclusion. Draped in black crowned with jewels, she now re-emerged as a figure not just of Britain, but of empire itself. Historians still argue whether the title truly strengthened imperial bonds or was mostly symbolic flattery for the Queen. Either way, it thrilled her and gave the monarchy a new imperial glamour. A quirky tidbit, Victoria insisted on learning Hindustani and Urdu phrases from her Indian attendants, particularly her later companion, Abdul Karim. She peppered her notes with words like Kush happy and Dil heart, scribbling them in her journals with girlish delight. Ministers rolled their eyes at her enthusiasm, but Victoria took genuine pleasure in this cultural connection. She even shocked courtiers by eating Indian curries prepared for her, which became a staple of her dinners at Osborne. Imagine the Queen of England eagerly spooning spicy dishes while courtiers fanned themselves nervously in the background. The proclamation of her new title was accompanied by grand displays. At Delhi in 1877, a vast durbar or imperial assembly was held with Indian princes and British officials gathered under colourful tents to hail Victoria as their sovereign. The Queen herself did not attend. She disliked long journeys and never visited India, but the spectacle was staged in her name. Elephants adorned with gold trappings paraded through crowds, cannons thundered, and officials proclaimed her supremacy. Back in Britain, she lapped up the report, seeing herself as the maternal figure of an empire stretching from the Scottish Highlands to the Himalayas. Yet the pomp of empire could not hide its tensions. Famines swept through India in the 1870s, killing millions. Critics argued that Britain's governance worsened the crisis, exporting grain, while people starved. Victoria expressed sorrow, but stopped short of questioning the system itself. Her letters reveal sympathy for her Indian subjects, yet her understanding of their suffering remained distant, filtered through officials who downplayed the empire's flaws. Still, the imperial turn reshaped her image. Once mocked as the recluse in black, she was now the grand matriarch of a global dominion. She relished being called the grandmother of Europe, as her children married into royal families across the continent. But Empress of India was the title that gave her a fresh aura of majesty. It allowed her to reclaim the throne not just as a widow of Windsor, but as a ruler whose influence stretched across oceans. Historians note that the Empress title also deepened the duality of Victoria's reign. On one hand, she cultivated a personal closeness with Indian servants, learning their words, cherishing their gifts. On the other, she presided over a system that treated millions as subjects without self-rule. The contradiction lay at the heart of her empire: intimacy and distance, affection and domination, all wrapped into one woman's crown. For Victoria herself, though, the contradiction hardly mattered. At last, she felt seen again, not as a broken widow, not as a recluse mocked in pamphlets, but as a sovereign adored across half the globe. The title of Empress rekindled her pride, giving her reign a second life of grandeur and global spectacle. By the mid-1880s, Victoria had reigned for nearly 50 years longer than many of her predecessors combined. What had begun as the story of a shy 18-year-old now unfolded as the saga of a matriarch who seemed immovable like a mountain on the horizon. In 1887, the nation prepared to celebrate her golden jubilee, 50 years on the throne, and what a spectacle it became. London turned into a carnival of loyalty. Streets were draped with bunting balconies groaned under garlands, and throngs poured in from across the empire. Representatives came not just from Scotland and Ireland, but from Canada, Australia, India, Africa, distant lands, where her face on coins and portraits was often the only Victoria her subjects had ever known. To them, the Jubilee was not simply a party. It was a confirmation of belonging to something vast and glittering. Mainstream fact: on June 21st, 1887, Victoria rode in a procession through London in an open carriage, cheered by tens of thousands. The route passed under triumphal arches while soldiers from every corner of the empire marched in their dazzling uniforms, Highlanders in kilts, sepoys from India, in turbans, African contingents in bright cloth. For the first time in decades, the Queen showed herself so visibly, and the people responded with thunderous joy. Historians still argue whether the Jubilee was more about Victoria herself or about Britain's self-image as a global empire. Perhaps both, for personal story and imperial destiny had long since become entangled. A quirky tidbit: the menu at her Jubilee banquet included not just English roasts, but exotic dishes from the colony's curries, tropical fruits, and even kangaroo tail soup. Imagine the bewildered faces of dignitaries politely spooning broth made from marsupial tail while trying to look regal. Victoria herself, true to form, stuck mostly to the simpler courses, preferring roast beef and puddings over exotic experiments. For the Queen, the Jubilee was more than a festival. It was a vindication. Decades earlier, she had been scorned for seclusion, mocked as Mrs. Brown, and accused of neglecting her people. Now in her 70s, she basked in adulation. Bells tolled, fireworks erupted, and even political rivals joined in the chorus of praise. She wrote in her diary, "No one ever, I believe, has met with such an ovation as was given to me." The Jubilee also reflected the paradox of her reign. The empire appeared at its zenith, railways, telegraphs, and trade connecting millions under her name. Yet beneath the glitter were cracks. Irish unrest simmered, colonial resistance brewed, and industrial workers at home grumbled at inequality. Historians still argue whether the Jubilee was a genuine celebration of loyalty or a distraction from growing tensions. But in the moment, none of that mattered to the jubilant crowds waving flags. Victoria herself seemed transformed by the outpouring. For years she had hidden behind black veils and Balmoral seclusion. Now, buoyed by cheers, she re-emerged as a national symbol. Age had softened her sternness. She smiled more, waved more, and allowed herself to be adored. The widow of Windsor had become the grandmother of the empire, a role she accepted with pride. Family, of course, played its part in the spectacle. Her children and grandchildren flocked to London, turning the city into a royal reunion. Many were married into Europe's royal houses, and photographs of the Jubilee show a dizzying array of crowns gathered under one roof. The Tsarevich of Russia, the Kaiser of Germany, the kings of Denmark and Greece, all kin to Victoria, all reminders that her dynastic web stretched across the continent. She was not only Empress of India, but in a sense Empress of Europe's bloodlines. And yet behind the pomp, her personal life still bore traces of solitude. John Brown had died 4 years earlier, and though she found new companionship in her Indian servant Abdul Karim, nicknamed the Munshi, she remained a widow at heart. Even amid cheers and fireworks, she returned each night to her diaries, writing faithfully of Albert, of the family he had left her, of the half-century she had survived without him. Still, the Jubilee mattered. It restored her image, renewed her popularity, and cemented her as the living embodiment of her age. To the public, she was no longer the hidden widow, but the monarch who had presided over progress, empire, and endurance. To Victoria, it was proof that she had not only survived grief and scandal, but triumphed over them. The little girl, trapped by the Kensington system, had now been queen for 50 years, and the world quite literally roared its approval. By the 1890s, Victoria had become more than a monarch. She was an institution, a living relic of an age that was transforming beneath her feet. She was now in her 70s, a frail figure who moved slowly with the help of a cane, her body curved with years of pregnancy's grief and unrelenting duty. And yet her stubborn will remained intact. Ministers sighed, children fretted, but Victoria continued to rule in her own style, blunt, immovable, and surprisingly sharp in her opinions. At Osborne House in Balmoral, she surrounded herself with dog servants and trusted attendants. Abdul Karim, her Indian munshi, had by this time become a fixture, teaching her Urdu and reading poetry aloud in translation. To courtiers, his presence was another scandal, echoing the whispers once directed at John Brown. For Victoria, however, Karim was a comfort, a reminder of her beloved India, and a man who treated her not just as a monarch, but as a woman with feelings. She delighted in scribbling Urdu phrases in her journals, beaming when she could recite them back. Mainstream fact. Her devotion to Karim caused family and ministers to panic. They feared he had too much influence, that he was receiving favours and confidences inappropriate for a servant. Eventually, after her death, her family destroyed many of their letters in a fit of scandal management. Historians still argue whether Victoria's attachment was maternal romantic or simply the fierce loyalty she always gave to those who treated her as a human being rather than a crown. A quirky tidbit shows her enduring stubborn streak. When courtiers once tried to persuade her to dismiss Karim, she snapped that she was Queen of England and Empress of India, and she would not be dictated to about whom she kept in her household. Imagine the awkward silence in that drawing room, aged Victoria glaring down ministers like a scolding schoolmistress. Her later years were filled with a curious blend of routine and drama. She read novels in the evenings, wrote page after page in her diary, and dictated letters with a clarity that often shocked those who thought her fading. She meddled in family affairs across Europe, trying to orchestrate marriages and alliances. Her grandchildren dotted thrones everywhere: Germany, Russia, Greece, Spain, earning her the nickname the grandmother of Europe. But with family came conflict. She quarrelled with Bertie, still dismissing him as lazy and irresponsible, even as he waited impatiently to inherit the crown. She scolded grandchildren for what she considered frivolous behaviour. She mourned the deaths of children and friends, her circle of contemporaries shrinking year by year. Each funeral reminded her of time's relentless march. At the same time, society itself was shifting. The Victorian age, once defined by industry progress and confidence, was now facing questions of poverty, women's rights, and the costs of empire. Socialists organized rallies, suffragettes demanded votes, and strikes revealed deep cracks in the industrial system. Yet through it all, Victoria remained a steady figurehead. For many, her very presence, unchanging, familiar, eternal, was reassuring, even if she seemed increasingly out of step with modernity. Historians debate whether her later years were marked by wisdom or simply stubborn inertia. She resisted reforms she didn't like, complained about new fashions, and grumbled about inventions she found unnecessary. Yet she also adapted in small ways. She allowed the telephone to be installed at Osborne, and she even permitted a film camera to record her jubilee in 1897. Imagine the astonishment of seeing the Queen, who had lived through the age of candlelight, captured on flickering film, immortalized in moving pictures. Through frailty and pain, she kept going. She suffered rheumatism, poor eyesight, and difficulty walking, but she refused to surrender her routines. Wrapped in layers of shawls, she presided over dinners, audiences, and councils with the same determination she had shown as a fiery 18-year-old. Age might bend her body, but it never bent her will. In her later portraits, she looks every inch the matriarch, plump, unsmiling, draped in black, a face carved by decades of endurance. Yet behind those stern eyes was still the girl who once defied Conroy, the woman who adored Albert the widow, who clung to plaster casts of a lost hand. Her reign, now the longest in British history, was itself a testament to survival, to resilience, to the sheer force of refusing to yield. The empire she ruled was vast, the society she presided over restless, but Victoria herself remained steady, a stubborn, aging lighthouse in the stormy seas of change. By the turn of the century, Victoria was a woman of nearly 80, her reign stretching back so far that few living could remember a time before her. The young queen, who once trembled at dawn in Kensington, had become an old woman draped in black, her figure frail yet still commanding. The empire had grown enormous, her family had scattered across Europe's thrones, and the 20th century pressed close at hand. Her final years were marked by both continuity and decline. She still held councils, still signed papers, still fussed over family affairs. But her health faltered. Rheumatism stiffened her joints, making it painful to walk. Cataracts dimmed her eyesight. Ministers noted that her handwriting grew shakier, her once vigorous diary entries shorter. Yet her mind remained sharp. She continued to offer blunt opinions on politics, sometimes surprising ministers with her clarity. Mainstream fact: she lived to see her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, marking 60 years on the throne. The celebrations were even grander than her Golden Jubilee a decade earlier. Her carriage rolled through streets lined with millions, while soldiers from every corner of the empire saluted. Ships across the globe fired salutes, and churches rang bells in unison. It was in many ways the crowning moment of her reign, an affirmation that she embodied not only a nation, but an age. Historians still argue whether the Diamond Jubilee reflected genuine loyalty, or was papering over the cracks of empire which was beginning to face serious challenges. A quirky tidbit: during the Jubilee, when her carriage paused, Victoria was delighted by the sight of colonial troops riding alongside her Zulu, Sikhs, Canadians in fur hats. She remarked in her diary how much she enjoyed their colourful uniforms, even describing the cheerful turbans with girlish delight. It was as if the Empress of India, grandmother of Europe, was still a curious child marvelling at costumes in her doll collection. But by 1900 the weight of years pressed heavily. The Boer War in South Africa troubled her deeply, filling newspapers with grim headlines. The deaths of soldiers, the reports of concentration camps, the divisiveness of the conflict all unsettled her in her final months. She worried about the strain on her empire, even as she clung to pride in its endurance. Family, too, filled her last days with both comfort and strain. Her son Bertie remained a source of frustration. She doubted his seriousness, scolded him even in middle age, and worried what would happen when he finally inherited the crown. Yet she also recognized grudgingly that he had matured and would carry the monarchy forward. Her youngest Beatrice remained constantly by her side, acting as companion, secretary and caretaker. Grandchildren visited, bringing gossip from courts in Berlin, St. Petersburg and Madrid. It was a reminder that her bloodline stretched across Europe, a web of dynasties that would ironically soon be torn apart by World War. Victoria's last journey began in January 1901 at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. She grew weaker, her appetite fading, her body tired beyond recovery. Doctors hovered, family gathered, ministers waited anxiously. On January 22nd, as the winter sun sank, she slipped into unconsciousness. At 6:30 in the evening, Queen Victoria died. The news reverberated like an earthquake. Bells tolled across Britain. Black crepe appeared on doorways and newspapers declared the end of an era. Crowds gathered in hushed silence, realizing they were living through history's hinge. For many, she was the only monarch they had ever known. Her death was not just personal, it was national, imperial, global. The funeral was as grand as her reign had been long. She had requested a white coffin, not black, and to be buried with mementos of her life: Albert's dressing gown, John Brown's photograph locks of hair from her children. Soldiers escorted her coffin through London, where millions lined the streets in reverent silence. On February 4th, she was laid to rest beside Albert in the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore, finally reunited with the man she had mourned for 4 decades. And with her burial, the Victorian age officially closed, giving way to the Edwardian era, and a century that would prove far more turbulent than anyone at the time could imagine. The world that gathered around Queen Victoria's coffin in 1901 knew instinctively that an age had ended. Her reign had spanned 63 years, the longest of any British monarch, until Elizabeth III, covering a stretch of history that transformed Britain from a kingdom of carriages and candlelight into an empire of railways, telegraphs, and global reach. She was not merely a sovereign. She had become the symbol of an epoch so vast that it bore her name, the Victorian age. Her legacy, however, was anything but simple. To admirers, she embodied stability and morality. She gave the monarchy a domestic human face, presenting herself as wife, mother, and grandmother as much as queen. In an era when revolutions toppled thrones across Europe, she endured. That very endurance, coupled with her careful cultivation of family values, helped secure the monarchy's survival into the modern age. Mainstream fact: Victoria's reign oversaw monumental changes, industrial growth, imperial expansion, social reform, and scientific breakthroughs. Under her, Britain became the workshop of the world, producing steel textiles and ships that connected continents. Yet at the same time, cities swelled with poverty slums, festered, and inequality widened. Historians still argue whether the Victorian age should be remembered for progress or for hypocrisy, an era of railways and reform bills, or of child labour and colonial exploitation. Her personal contradictions mirrored those of her empire. She was both fiercely private and insistently public. She adored Albert, yet clung fiercely to her authority. She was fascinated by her Indian servants and culture, yet presided over an empire that often crushed the very lands she romanticized. She demanded loyalty from her children, but often smothered them with judgment. She seemed timeless, yet the very world she ruled was racing toward modernity at dizzying speed. A quirky tidbit about her legacy: Victoria's descendants intermarried so extensively across Europe that haemophilia carried in her bloodline spread to several royal houses, including Russia's. This medical inheritance would play a role in the downfall of the Romanovs, meaning her influence, for better or worse, echoed far beyond her own empire. The grandmother of Europe had unwittingly passed on both crowns and curses. And then there was her image, the young queen of 1837, with sparkling eyes and girlish shyness, gave way to the plump, stern widow in black, whose portraits hung in post offices and schools from Canada to Calcutta. Yet even that severe visage became comforting, a reminder of continuity in a world of dizzying change. She was not glamorous like some monarchs, nor dazzling in rhetoric, but she was steady. And sometimes steadiness is the rarest quality of all. When she died, she left behind a monarchy, both strengthened and reshaped. By withdrawing from political entanglements and emphasizing ceremonial and symbolic roles, she laid the groundwork for the constitutional monarchy that survives in Britain today. Her successors would wield influence through spectacle, tradition, and symbolism more than raw power, a model she intentionally or not had perfected. And what of Victoria herself? Historians still debate whether she should be remembered as a great ruler, or as a symbol carried along by greater forces, industry, empire, politics, that would have marched forward with or without her. Perhaps the truth lies in between. She was no revolutionary thinker, no military strategist, no master of diplomacy. But she was a survivor. She endured loneliness, scandal, grief, and criticism, and through sheer stubbornness held her throne for more than 6 decades. Her story is one of contradictions, private sorrow, and public grandeur, fierce will, and fragile heart. And those contradictions made her human. Perhaps that more than the titles of queen or empress is why her name still lingers on our tongues, Victoria. As the 20th century dawned and the guns of the Boer War still echoed, Britain stood at the height of its power, but also on the edge of new storms. The Victorian age was over, but its imprint, industrial, cultural, imperial, remained woven into the fabric of the world. And in the quiet mausoleum at Frogmore, Victoria, finally rested beside Albert, her angel, after 40 years of longing. The little girl from Kensington, once trapped in isolation, had ruled half the world. Now, as the story of Queen Victoria fades into silence, let your mind drift with it. Imagine the hush of Windsor Gardens at dusk, the air cool and steady, the last glow of sun touching stone walls, where ivy curls in patient spirals. A single candle flickers in a high window, its light soft and golden, spilling gently across the dark. Picture Victoria herself, not in the grandeur of Jubilee parades, nor in the heavy robes of state, but in her quiet moments wrapped in shawls, pen in hand, gazing across misty lawns with eyes that had seen both joy and sorrow. The world pressed constantly upon her, and yet she found comfort in words, in the loyalty of companions, and in the rhythm of seasons turning again and again. As you breathe slowly, now feel the weight of history lift from your shoulders. Let the clamour of empire and the noise of politics recede into the distance. What remains is the image of a woman who endured, sometimes fragile, sometimes fierce, always determined. Her reign was long, her burdens heavy, yet she carried them until the very end. Allow the stillness of that final scene to wrap around you like a warm blanket. The worries of the day, your tasks unfinished, your anxieties unspoken, can rest for now, just as the Queen herself rests at last beside the man she loved. Time moves forward always, but in this moment you can linger calm and unhurried in the quiet. The story is complete. The torches have dimmed, the carriages have rolled away, and the palace is silent. All that remains is peace, soft, unbroken, and timeless. Take another slow, deep breath. Let your thoughts drift like leaves on a gentle stream carrying you away into sleep. The world will wait for you until morning. Tonight you are safe, and the past has sung you softly toward rest.